Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. So there is a flurry of lost treasure stories out in the West. And a lot of times I'll look for stuff out east because I know a lot of my listeners are probably closer to the East Coast also. And I found a good one that dates back to the Revolutionary War times in Connecticut. So this one is about some Tories that stole a Revolutionary War fund that was these newly minted gold George Washington coins from France meant to help fund the war. So this story starts out in the 1770s. So a man named Lemuel Bates, he rose to the rank of captain in the Continental Army. And he also owned a tavern in East Granby, Connecticut. So this tavern rested on a well-worn route from Philadelphia to Boston and vice versa. So this tavern not only served as a tavern that served drinks, but it was also a restaurant, and it was also a hotel as it rented rooms upstairs to people too. So the Revolutionary Army or the Continental Army, they used this tavern many times for a meeting place. And one evening in 1779, Lemuel Bates heard a loud procession pull up outside. So he went outside and he saw 13 wagons pulled up, and each was pulled by 4 horses. So it became obvious that they were pulling a lot of weight. And in the company of these wagons were quite a few Continental Army soldiers. The commander of these Yankee soldiers stepped down from one of the wagons and he explained to the tavern owner that they came from Boston a few days earlier and they were headed to Philadelphia. And, that was still a couple hundred wagon miles to the southwest. So he said that their traveling was going very slow due to the excessive weight that they were carrying. And each wagon was carrying trunks full of gold, or most of the wagons were. And these were gold Washington dollars, he said, and these Washington dollars were minted in France with George Washington's likeness on them. And they were meant to help fund the war. And I believe at this point in the war, the U.S. or the Continental Army were doing a lot better than in the early stages of the war, so we were starting to get some French help now. So they were supposed to be a loan to the United States, these George Washington dollars, and some wagons had these chests of gold dollars, and the rest of the wagons carried guns, goods, and supplies needed for the journey. So as the commander and the tavern owner, Lemuel, visited, a crowd started to form to see what all the fuss was about with this wagon convoy. And a couple of dozen uniformed Continental Army soldiers, they kept the crowd away from the wagons. So the commander, he fed his troops at the tavern, and he decided they would actually go ahead and stay the night there. And the word of this wagon train with these gold-laden chests was already starting to spread around the countryside. And the commander placed armed guards around these wagons for the night, and they were supposed to make sure nothing happened to the cargo. And as word spread around, some Tories loyal to the British cause caught word of what was at the tavern, and some of them met up that night to put a plan into action to try to steal this cargo. So they snuck into the woods nearby and just watched and waited. And at one point in the middle of the night, they felt like they saw their opportunity. And it's believed that a couple of the guards may have fallen asleep, and that made the remaining guards more easy pickings. And the Tories sprung into action, and it was said that they had sliced the throats of the guards that were awake, and then probably also dispatched the ones that fell asleep. So they quietly hitched the horses back up to the wagons that had the gold-laden chests in them, and it was said that it was approximately $2.5 million worth of gold in 1779. So it was a lot of weight in gold and a lot of money. But these Tories, they escaped into the night, and just after dawn, the dead soldiers were discovered, and they were found behind the tavern, and they found that some wagons were missing. The ones with the gold were missing. So some of the soldiers borrowed horses in the area to go look for the missing wagons, and a couple hours later, the wagons and teams of horses were found just a couple miles away in a farmer's field or pasture. And it was apparent that the horses were more than, they had gone more than just 2 miles, as they seemed pretty exhausted. So they could tell that the horses were worked pretty hard overnight, and they were grazing in the field. They didn't go just the 2 miles. They had probably pulled this cargo for quite a ways. So the wagons, of course, were empty now, and the farmer whose land this was on, he was questioned, but he didn't know how the horses and the wagons got on his property, and the farmer's house and barn and property, they were all searched just to be sure, but they found nothing. And the soldiers searched the area for like a week before returning to Boston defeated and awaiting what punishment may come to them. And nothing was ever found at this time. So then in 1880, a local resident named Richard H. Phelps, he wrote a book about the history of the area and recounted this story. So he told about a man named Henry Worcester, who was a resident of East Granby in the 1770s and was constantly in trouble, and he was also a Tory. And if you don't know the details about the Tories were just people that sided with the British during the American Revolution. So this gentleman, Henry Worcester, he was a Tory, and about 5 months after the theft of the Washington dollars, Henry was sentenced to prison for stealing a cow, and he was sentenced to hard labor at the Newgate prison place just outside of East Granby. So after serving about 6 months, it was said that he escaped and he headed for the coast. So he got work on a ship that was heading to England, and since he was a Tory and sided with England, he probably figured that was the best place for him to go. And once in England for a while and actually earning an honest living, he decided to stay, and he continued on as a law-abiding English citizen at that point. And a few months later, his mother, who still lived in East Granby, got a letter from her son Henry, and in the letter he confessed to his part in the theft of the chest filled with the Washington dollars from the tavern that night. And in the letter he told the story of taking the wagons. He said it was himself and a group of Tories, and he said they stole the wagons and they ended up somewhere on the east bank of the East Fork of Salmon Brook. And he said here they unloaded the chests and they buried them close to the stream. And they made an agreement that they would return after the heat was off and split up the treasure and then use some to help the British cause for the war effort. So the plan was divide up some of the money, use some of it for the British war effort, and each man swore an oath of death if he disobeyed. So they covered the last of the soil over the chest as the sun rose. So all of the Tories hopped in the wagon then, or the wagons, and they headed back towards East Granby on a different route than they came. When only a couple miles from town, that was when they ditched the wagons and horses and they quickly returned home. So he said about 6 weeks later, the Tories met in the woods at a remote location to make a plan for retrieving the Washington dollars very soon after that. And as they stood in the woods at night discussing things, they were attacked by Native Americans, and all were killed except for Worcester. He hadn't been seen by the natives, and he was able to carefully sneak away or hide in the darkness. And since the Tories weren't armed, because they were just having a quick little meeting, they were massacred, and it was quick. So now Worcester started to make plans himself to return to the treasure site when he was caught stealing the cow and sentenced to prison. And he escaped to England, and he was never able to return. It sounds like he wasn't able to put enough money together to return. And this is why he wrote the letter. It was said that he tried to tell his mother about the fortune. So Henry's mother, I'm sure, probably asked for more details than just the east bank of the East Fork of Salmon Brook. But it was said Henry died before being able to provide more details or write more letters, and his mother never found the treasure. So East Granby residents, they looked for this treasure for many years after the theft, and no one ever found anything. And that is until 1944, after some torrential downpours that led to the swelling of the Salmon Brook over its banks quite a bit, and the water currents had eroded a lot of the banks away in many places, and when the waters receded, the stream returned back to normal, and an East Granby resident was walking along the stream, and he spotted something shining in the water. And when he reached down to pick it up, he realized it was one of those gold Washington dollars that he had heard about. And when the man returned to town and he showed his find, then the search was on by a lot of townsfolk again. And I'm sure by everyone that knew the story. But nothing was ever found at that point except for the one that he found in the stream. In 1958, 3 teenage boys were playing in the creek of the East Fork of Salmon Brook, and they found 3 strange coins. And they didn't say anything for a while until one of the boys showed his father about a week later. Finally, his father was able to figure out what it was by showing it to a collector in Hartford, Connecticut. And the son and his father then returned to the spot that the coins were found, but they couldn't find any more. In 1987, a woman was traveling on Connecticut Highway 20 when she got a flat tire just a few feet from the bridge over the East Fork of Salmon Brook. And after changing her tires, she went down to the bank to wash her hands. And as she kneeled down washing her hands in the water, she spotted a coin shining a few feet away, and she grabbed it. And a few days later, it was ID'd as a gold George Washington dollar. No one else found any since that time, though. So it's very likely that the chests have completely rotted and some of the coins have been washed downstream. But depending on how close to the bank the chests were buried, that may determine if most of the gold is still very near the original burial site or not. So gold is very heavy and doesn't move much unless the currents are very swift. And this brook may not usually have waters or currents that can move gold very much, maybe only once in a great while. So much of the gold may still be very close to where it was buried initially, and it's said that it would be worth millions of dollars today. So that is the story of the George Washington gold dollars that have been missing since the time of the Revolutionary War.